The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it. Famously known as the graveyard of empires, the country of Afghanistan has a reputation for resisting change from the outside that has practically become the stuff of legend. The United States learned that lesson in painful fashion when it ended the longest war in its history. After 20 years, 4 presidents, trillions of dollars, and thousands of lives lost, the United States, its allies, and the whole world witnessed the Taliban retake control of Afghanistan within days of its formal withdrawal. With heartbreaking images of people clinging to the outside of planes about to take off, and babies being desperately hoisted above crowds to be handed to American soldiers, the world at large was left asking the question, how was it that seemingly no one saw this coming? Akshobh Giridharadas spoke with Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center, to get his assessment of life in Afghanistan in the era of Taliban 2.0.
With all the events that's going on in the world today, it's almost like Afghanistan is the dust may have settled, or maybe no one looking at the dust in Afghanistan now with incidents in Russia and Ukraine. But what is Taliban 2.0 like? What's life in Afghanistan for ordinary Afghans like in a Taliban 2.0 era?
Unfortunately, Taliban 2.0 is a lot like Taliban 1.0. What we're seeing with the Taliban these days is very similar to what we saw with the Taliban in the 90s when they were also in control in Afghanistan. They have really brought back the most retrogressive policies that they'd had in the past, particularly in terms of restrictions on women, on travel and movement. Most recently, this new burqa decree, which of course impacts the women's appearances in public. And of course, the Taliban also not too long ago reneged on an earlier promise to allow older girls to go back to school. They really have not made much of an effort to gain internal legitimacy. It seems like some of the most big ticket things that the group have done over the last few weeks include things like hosting ceremonies for the families of suicide bombers, as well as hosting these big military parades. Now, of course, the Taliban themselves would say that they've changed in a big way. They have, in the sense that they now understand the power of technology. They used to ban technology. Now they embrace it, mainly in order to use for public relations and propaganda purposes. They try to use social media to tell a story about the group that's in many ways not true. They try to use social media to post messages about how they've had meetings with diplomats and how they're trying to rebuild the country, and so forth and so on. That's really the only way the Taliban have changed. They embrace technology. They understand the importance of public relations. And I would argue, final point, that they do care a lot more about gaining international recognition and legitimacy. They care more about that now than they did in the past. But they still don't care about it in a huge way, but more so than in the past.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And I want to touch on some of the Taliban propaganda and their relation with other visiting diplomats. But I suppose take this back to U.S. foreign policy, where you and I are based in D.C. And of course, a lot of what's happened in Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan sort of starts in Washington. Suppose from a U.S. foreign policy point of view, the war in Afghanistan, the longest war, longer than Vietnam, began obviously with this hardline militia government in the 90s that was seen aiding and abetting Osama bin Laden, the perpetrator of 9/11, seen as, with the lines between Al-Qaeda and some of the Taliban hardliners were very blurry back then. And when obviously we know when Taliban didn't give up Osama bin Laden, they obviously went in crosshairs, the war on terror began. But 20 years later, people would say you spent trillions to the exchequer and you've just replaced the Taliban with the Taliban. Is that a fair assessment, a fair critique of U.S. foreign policy in Afghanistan?
Yes, unfortunately, that's correct. I mean, we've come literally full circle, right? You had this U.S.-led operation in Afghanistan in October 2001 that knocked out the Taliban from power. But then, of course, nearly 20 years later, the Taliban returned much more quickly than many in Washington expected. And as a result, you had these terrible optics of U.S. forces and really NATO forces and NATO civilian personnel chaotically exiting the country with the Taliban in control. Indeed, it really was a very sobering end to this very difficult and I would argue even disastrous U.S. experience in Afghanistan over nearly 20 years.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're sticking on that part as well, because this obviously, Biden said this was not a forever war. He said he didn't want to, turn this over to a fifth president. Biden, of course, is no stranger to foreign policy. He was chairman of Senate Foreign Relations Committee, vice president for 8 years under the Obama administration. I remember in 2012 in a debate with Paul Ryan, his opposite counterpart then, who was running for vice president on the Republican ticket, he said, we're planning to withdraw by 2014. That, of course, didn't fructify. But, when he said that the withdrawal would happen before 9/11, and of course, Afghanistan fell well before 9/11 in August. And when you see Afghans literally plummeting to their deaths, hanging on to planes, how can anyone possibly believe, or how can anyone with that level of intelligence at the NSC, at the White House, at State, believe that Taliban 2.0 would be different, or there would be progress, or the United States, any of the 20 years, the progress would continue in some miraculous form?
Yeah, it's a good question. First, in terms of Biden himself, indeed, it's important to emphasize that he was, much like his predecessor, Donald Trump, was not comfortable being in Afghanistan. And President Biden has never been comfortable being in Afghanistan. You note he's had a long, distinguished career. Back when he was vice president in the Obama administration, he was really the only sole holdout in that administration against the troop surge that, of course, President Obama announced. He didn't want that. He disagreed, but obviously he was outvoted. And certainly he and his team had a brief and somewhat frenetic policy debate about what to do when they took over, whether they should honor the agreement that the Trump administration had signed with the Taliban, calling on the U.S. That stipulated U.S. forces leave, or try to do something different. And in the end, he of course did back that agreement. I would argue that many U.S. officials and also officials from other Western capitals may have been fooled and bamboozled even by the fact that you have this very different type of Taliban that's been based in Doha for a number of years at the so-called political office of the Taliban. And these are folks that have been there specifically to engage with the world. They understand how to engage with Western officials and with diplomats from everywhere. And they do tend to be more moderate. And, the big name here is Mullah Baradar, who had led the Taliban negotiating team when the negotiations with the U.S. were happening for quite some time. And he is a moderate. He would not necessarily agree with some of these ideological views in terms of what we've seen the Taliban doing with their restrictions on women and so on. He and those like him would be of the view that it's important to engage with the world. It's important to gain more legitimacy and recognition from the world, and that entails being more practical. And that in turn entails moderating the Taliban's ideology, which the hardliners would never want to do and never will do. And clearly, what we've seen happen in recent months is what's really played out with the Taliban for nearly its entire existence, and that's that the most hardline elements of the group call the shots. And today, with the Taliban regime, it's the most hardline elements that are in control. Mullah Baradar and his ilk have been sidelined, and I think that for many U.S. officials that had dealt with those moderates, perhaps they've gotten this rude awakening. They've seen what the Taliban is really like, and with it now in control, they've recognized that the hardliners are going to have their say. They're never going to compromise on ideology, because if that happened, the Taliban would cease to be the Taliban for sure. So again, I think a lot of wake-up calls have been happening in recent months.
Yeah, you mentioned about Qatar and Doha, and that's obviously I want to get to it a little bit later, because I remember my work being right across the Qatari embassy, and during the Afghanistan crisis, it's back convoys. And of course, this speaks about Qatar's foreign policy. But just on that note, and I completely understand that the Biden administration also inherited this mess, and of course from the previous successive administration as well. Trump obviously set the motion to leave, expedited it. Pompeo did meet Mullah Baradar back then, and Biden, of course, didn't veer away. He almost accentuated that policy. But just talking about successive administration, Michael, obviously it was George Bush started this. Just if you look at some of the assessments of the past 3-4 administrations, partly from the Bush administration, one is, of course, Bush also had the war in Iraq, which cost the exchequer and perhaps distracted with the simultaneous war in Afghanistan, or what the United States was trying to do in Afghanistan, because many do not see the war in Iraq justified. At the same time, Trump having this cobbled agreement with Afghanistan, with Zalmay Khalilzad being the key face of the U.S. government negotiation, and now Biden just signing off. I mean, was this a domino effect across 20 years of lack of sufficient policy planning to know that while the Taliban went away, Michael, they never really went away. They just were insurgents when they weren't in government.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's really what I would describe it. Yeah, it's a series of failed policies over the course of, I guess, 3 administrations. But I would also argue the failure to develop an overarching and sustainable strategy for the war effort in Afghanistan. I think it's become an evergreen question of what went wrong in Afghanistan. There's so many answers, but I think one answer is the fact that there was not a clear-cut strategy to guide U.S. efforts. When President Bush first sent troops there, obviously it was all about counterterrorism and a response to the 9/11 attacks, with this very narrowly focused goal of going after the perpetrators, going after al-Qaeda, going after bin Laden, and of course, after the Taliban refused to give up bin Laden, going after the Taliban as well. So those were some very specific objectives. They were achieved very quickly. But then from that point on, I would argue that you had this extended mission creep, sort of like a mission creep on steroids for many years, where you never had a clear strategy to replace that. Was it all about nation building and bringing a more sort of ambiguous, vague semblance of stability? Was it about trying to create more pathways for economic development? What was it all about? That was never made clear. And I think with the Obama administration, the idea was to try to create the conditions on the battlefield for an eventual negotiation with the Taliban, and that's what the surge was all about. It was meant to bring in more U.S. troops, more NATO troops, to put the Taliban on the defensive, and make the Taliban willing to have a negotiation. But we saw that did not work out. At any rate, the Obama administration was not willing to hold negotiations with the Taliban, because the Taliban always insisted that any negotiations with the U.S. only involve the U.S. and not the Afghan government. That's something the Obama administration never agreed with. And then, of course, came President Trump, who just wanted to get out, and that was his complete focus. Though I will say, with President Trump, he did bring back a more sharp focus to the war effort. For him, the goal was again counterterrorism. I still remember when he gave his Afghanistan strategy speech soon after he took office. I guess it was in August of 2017. He said, "We're not in Afghanistan to nation build. We're there to kill terrorists." It sounds sort of cliched and even cartoonish, but that he was laying out a clear strategy. Yeah, so credit goes to him for that. But yeah, I just think that there was never a clear effort to develop a sustainable long-term strategy. You just had a lot of back and forth, a lot of ambiguous thinking about what was the best path forward, and we see what the results were. Obviously, there are other reasons to explain why the U.S. failed in Afghanistan, but that is an important factor right there.
Michael, I want to pick up on something you said, which gets me to a new segue. You said the U.S. wasn't there to nation build under the Trump administration, or the Trump administration believed that. But one would argue, say, countries like India, which invested close to $3 billion with no boots on the ground, that investment was to hospitals, to schools, to roads, to railways, to building a new parliament, which I think Prime Minister Modi himself inaugurated on his visit to Kabul. But knowing that, and there was also U.S.-led troops training Afghan army as well. So one would argue that was a form of nation build, if not just counterterrorism, because for posterity. But knowing that there's also an economic warfare in the region. If the U.S. were to leave, that vacuum, there are so many players, particularly China, with the Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC. China would do what it's done across the region, the sort of economic debt trap colonization in some ways, come in, and we've seen Wang Yi meet Mullah Baradar. So if the belief was the U.S. is not there a nation build, someone else is going to come and do that. And I know the United States has constantly not there's never been a sense of comfort with Beijing taking over investment projects in regions that America has been very much part of.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, some great points and a lot to unpack there. I think that this phrase "nation building" has sort of taken on this negative connotation in recent years, which is a shame because there is a lot of good that's come out of these efforts by foreign countries to try to contribute more to infrastructure development and so on in other countries. But oftentimes it fails and goes badly. And indeed, the U.S. did do a lot of what we could describe as nation building in Afghanistan. But the problem is you had this model that entailed throwing huge amounts of money into these unrealistically ambitious development projects that ended up not working because they essentially left the Afghan people with the responsibility for managing these huge projects without the money for it. So as a result, you had these big electricity projects that went up, these big dams that were built, and Afghans couldn't, they lacked the absorptive capacity to manage all the money that was entailed with them. And then there was the lack of technical expertise, and at the end of the day, they just didn't have the money to handle it once the initial huge amounts of money was used. And I think there's been criticism that gets into these bureaucratic issues of U.S. development agencies like USAID being sustained by this model of trying to spend as much money as possible just to show that they're getting the job done and then moving on. It's just a disastrous strategy. And it's not only in Afghanistan where this has been used, it's been used in Pakistan as well. But indeed, China, you talk about U.S.-China competition, one of the areas where China clearly has the comparative advantage is on these infrastructure development projects because it's able to mobilize a lot of capital very quickly and it's willing to take on a lot of the responsibilities on its own. It hasn't done this in Afghanistan. It's actually been very cautious over the years. It has owned a copper mine outside of Kabul. It's got a few other investments, but it's held back over the years. It may well try to do more now. And indeed, the Taliban is really keen to get China in there because it knows what types of things that China can do. But the U.S. track record on the so-called nation-building front in Afghanistan is not very good. Not to say that there were no success stories, but it really was not a successful effort on the whole.
So, Michael, I know we touched a little on Biden and presidents, but just go a little further cabinet level, right? I mean, we talk about NSA Jake Sullivan, who perhaps this is the strongest purview, along with Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Even Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, said he couldn't foresee a collapse in 11 days. And a lot of people would say this seems so far-fetched. I mean, you've been following Afghanistan for a while. I remember our first conversation on Afghanistan was long before the fall of Kabul. And a lot of people like us who are not in government are sort of sensing or seeing this rapid movement. We're talking to people on the ground, seeing an escalation of Taliban violence. How would people at the highest echelons of government, of the most secure, of the most technologically sophisticated and military prowess, not see this coming or assume this would, it would unfold the way it unfolded?
Yeah, it's an important question. And indeed, it's true that very few people here anticipated the Taliban would take over so quickly. And I should, by the way, I mean, that is a major reason why the last few weeks of the withdrawal were so chaotic, because when the Biden administration was doing all the scenario planning after they committed to the full withdrawal, when they were doing scenario planning, I think it's quite clear that they did not anticipate the seemingly least likely but the most catastrophic possible scenario, and that would be, the Taliban taking over before they can leave. And that's why things got so chaotic, because they didn't have a plan for how to get people out quickly with the Taliban in control. So that's an important factor. In terms of why U.S. officials, including those that would be privy to the most, the best intelligence and so on, I really don't have an answer. I think it's a combination of factors. One thing I could point to is that for so many years, U.S. officials and successive governments had tried to always put a happy face on a very disturbing situation. So there would be these constant efforts to sugarcoat what was happening and to minimize how bad things really were going. And one of the biggest jokes became U.S. officials, both civilian and military, would say so frequently that we're turning the corner in Afghanistan and that things are starting to change. But clearly the corner was never turned because things never got better. So maybe it was that sense of complacent complacency, delusion, whatever you want to call it, not recognizing that things really could get really bad, even more than you think, especially if you're forcing yourself to think that things are better than they really are. Beyond that, I just think that there was a genuine inability to appreciate just how weak the structural elements of the Afghan military were, in the sense not enough of a recognition of how low morale was, of how poor the communication was between the military leadership and the government and government leaders, not appreciating just how many desertions there were each year. But clearly the Pentagon knew, but I think not fully appreciating the scale of that and the impact that could have on battlefield performance because of the impacts on morale and so on and so forth. So I think those are several factors, but I think it's going to take several years and a lot of research will have to be done to get a better sense as to why you had so many smart, well-informed folks with access to the best intelligence not anticipating what would happen with the Taliban takeover happening so quickly.
Yeah, you mentioned about the lack of military readiness for Afghan soldiers. Of course, this was never hinted at. Biden's press conference said no, they expect the Afghan forces to hold up longer. But would you say the coup de grace of this whole unwinding happened with the surreptitious withdrawal from Bagram airspace, which had been such a focus point, the center base for U.S.-led forces in Afghanistan, U.S.-led NATO forces in Afghanistan, and a withdrawal overnight in July from what reports I've read, without even telling the local Afghans that they were working with or other NATO forces. I mean, this sort of made them sitting ducks for what was about to unfold.
Right, and I think this perhaps gets to the breakdown in relations between the Biden administration and the Afghan government in its final days, or the final days of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the Ghani government. They just didn't get along, and I think that's important to remember. You'd had this history with the last two Afghan presidents, Ghani and Karzai, before him, that when they first came to power, they really were seen as the best. The best possible options by U.S. officials in Washington, but then relations would sour in both cases, especially with Karzai. Things really got bad between the Obama administration and Karzai, including Biden, who of course was the vice president. According to a number of reports, there had even been a few meetings in which Biden and Karzai got into shouting matches. I think relations with Ghani were a bit better, but they were not good. And I think the Ghani administration did not like the way in which the Biden administration was going about things. At one point, not long before the withdrawal, Secretary of State Blinken, there was a letter that was leaked that was written by Secretary of State Blinken to President Ghani, in which he stated very forcefully that Afghanistan has to do X, Y, or Z, X, Y, and Z, including conceivably Ghani stepping down in order to salvage chances for a peace for peace talks and so on. So it was just a bad state of affairs, and I think with the Biden administration so set on getting out and preparing for that unfortunately it didn't place enough emphasis and priority on making sure to do the right types of engagement with the Ghani government, including on the turnover, the transition, so to speak, with the Bagram airbase withdrawal. It really is hard to believe in retrospect, but at the time it was just getting to be very chaotic. The administration was keen on getting out, completing the withdrawal, seeing how quickly the Taliban was moving and advancing, and not taking the proper protocol to tell things, to engage with the Ghani government. It's more likely when the two governments weren't getting along, for sure.
Yeah, speaking of the Ghani government, of course, he was excoriated for fleeing, and it was obviously recent comparison were done with Zelensky, how Zelensky statement. But people forget, and history can be, memories are very ephemeral, but what the last time Taliban came to power and had the chance of meeting Mosca Najibullah's daughter, we know what the Taliban did to him and hung his body up. So in some ways, one can't blame the Ghani himself, Ashraf Ghani, for fleeing, because the Taliban are known as militia, ragtag, hardliners. So would it be missing the forest for the trees to say that Ghani showed an act of cowardice? Because, the Shah of Iran has fled when the Ayatollahs came in the 79. And, we saw what happened when Najibullah didn't flee or when he was captured. So Ghani, in some ways, can one possibly blame Ghani?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's become a real toxic issue, I think, in the public discourse about the fall of Kabul and so forth. And to the point that even trying to give Ghani the benefit of the doubt can bring a lot of angry rebuttals in response. I mean, you're right. I think there's more cases of Ghanis than cases of Zelensky's. I mean, Zelensky is the extreme case. I mean, someone who's just refused to leave. Keeping in mind that Zelensky was a fairly unpopular leader before this all happened. He's redeemed himself for sure. But I think with Ghani, it's the idea that he knew what was coming, so to speak, and he did have opportunities. We now know through reportage from the Washington Post and several other outlets that in those final days and in those final hours before the Taliban takeover, there had been some deals in place. The U.S. had brokered, as I recall, a deal with the Taliban that would entail. I don't remember the specifics of it, but the idea was that the Taliban had agreed not to enter Kabul so long as Ghani would be willing to step down and engage in some negotiations with the U.S. and so forth. So in other words, Ghani had options, but at the end he just gave up and fled. And I think also, he had been given some very wrong information by his close aides, including, he was told that the Taliban had actually entered the presidential palace when they had not. So there's a lot going on here. But indeed, given that Ghani had been very unpopular to start with within Afghanistan, and given that he had seemed totally in denial about what was happening with the Taliban, the advances they were making, the fact that he wasn't doing anything to develop an emergency strategy, I think that all plays into the perceptions of him as well when he decided to leave abruptly.
Yeah, and I think a good segue to another topic that you follow closely. It's hard to deracinate and dehyphenate Pakistan from Afghanistan conundrum, and Pakistan also doesn't want that, because Pakistan also was a key player with any negotiation with the U.S. on Afghanistan, and of course AFPAC hyphenation codified by Richard Holbrooke. Imran Khan no longer in office, but he was given the sobriquet of Taliban Khan. He was accused of being soft on Taliban. Of course, he said there was no military solution, and all the comments that he made before he was in government, during he was in government. And the exact quote he said, and maybe to the extent I can quote, was talking about how Afghans have been liberated when that happened. Obviously, in some ways, this didn't go down with Washington. But what was, from your understanding, the national security apparatus in Pakistan, their role, their involvement, their understanding of the incidents that went down in Afghanistan? Because in the past, of course, from going back to the Carter Brzezinski eras, the ISI did give support to Mujahideen, of course, as on the same side. And the Taliban Pakistan was the first to recognize Taliban in the 90s, along with Saudi Arabia and UAE. So what's the current relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban, and how did Pakistan play a part in whatever unfolded in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so for sure, the Taliban insurgency endured and sustained because of the sanctuaries that Pakistan provided to its top leadership for nearly the entire 20-year U.S.-led war, and also the Pakistanis provided other types of assistance to Taliban fighters, including medical care and so on for Taliban fighters. So I'm not saying that there weren't other factors at play as well. I mean, if you'd had better, more effective, less corrupt Afghan governments during those 20 years, then it wouldn't have been as easy for the Taliban to make these insurgent inroads, so to speak, and gain footholds in rural areas and try to win hearts and minds, because they did a lot of that in rural parts of Afghanistan by pitching themselves as a better alternative to a corrupt Afghan government. So it's not only Pakistan that allowed the Taliban to sustain insurgency to sustain and endure, but it was definitely a key factor. Now, I think that Pakistan has always wanted there to be a pro-Pakistan government in Kabul. It's always worried about what India has done there, especially because India, as you know, had very strong relations with the non-Taliban governments in place. And as you had noted before, India was a really key developmental partner. It provided significant levels of economic assistance. And I think that there's a lot of goodwill among Afghans toward India, which you don't have as much of toward Pakistan, though there is some of that for sure. So anyway, Pakistan, for strategic reasons, has always wanted there to be a pro-Pakistan government in Kabul. So that's why I do think that Pakistan was perfectly comfortable to see the Taliban take office just because the Taliban had been an asset of Pakistan for a long time. But I think what Pakistan did not recognize, did not acknowledge, was that things would change. The Taliban would change. It would do things differently, would act differently once in power compared to when it was just an insurgent group and was heavily dependent on Pakistan for assistance. Now that it's in power, the Taliban is trying, though unsuccessfully, it is trying to gain legitimacy at home, and that has entailed trying to assert its independence from Pakistan. Because again, many, if not most Afghans, they don't trust Pakistan's government, don't trust its policies, and so the Taliban know that they need to try to make it clear that they're no longer, they're no longer the asset of Pakistan. They're no longer its proxy. So that's why you started to see the Taliban forcefully resist efforts by the Pakistani military defense off the border. It's why you've seen Taliban leaders start using really withering criticism about Pakistan, which is really striking, including one Taliban leader some time ago said that Pakistan is not it's not an appropriate or sufficient Islamic state, or doesn't have a satisfactory Islamic system. I mean, that's strong criticism. And then, of course, the biggest issue for Pakistan has been how the Taliban has handled the issue of the Pakistan Taliban, which, of course, is a separate group from the Taliban in Afghanistan, but they are ideologically aligned, and they're allies in the sense that the Pakistan Taliban for many years fought in Pakistan, but it has its base in Afghanistan, and in the past, its fighters have fought alongside the Afghan Taliban fighters in Afghanistan against U.S. forces. Bottom line, Pakistan expected the Taliban to help Pakistan address that security threat posed by the presence of the Pakistan Taliban in Afghanistan. The Taliban in Afghanistan has not done that because they're not going to turn on their Pakistan Taliban allies. They have tried to facilitate talks between the Pakistani state and the Pakistan Taliban. They haven't worked. They've not been willing to curb or expel the Pakistan Taliban leadership from Afghanistan. So as a result, you have this rather dicey situation where Pakistan in recent weeks has started to use airstrikes, military operations across the border in Afghanistan to target the Pakistan Taliban. So far as I understand, those strikes several weeks ago killed a lot of civilians. This is not something that's going to help Pakistan's cause in Afghanistan. It's not going to help its relations with the Taliban either. The Taliban does not accept the border with Pakistan, like most Afghan governments since Pakistan's independence. The Taliban does not welcome any foreign military activities in Afghanistan, including those by Pakistan. So it's really a tricky situation. Bottom line, though, I'll conclude here, Pakistan still sees the Taliban as its best bet in the sense that there's no alternatives. And I think the Taliban is also, it still recognizes the importance of Pakistan, because Pakistan is really the only country that's willing to go out there and advocate for the Taliban in global forums and call for the world to deliver more assistance directly to Afghanistan, directly to the Afghan government. I think the Taliban also sees Pakistan as the only country that would conceivably be willing to provide military advisors and help the Taliban rebuild their military. Even though Pakistan has not recognized the Taliban regime, the Taliban recognizes that Islamabad is willing to be a supporter in ways that you wouldn't have with any other government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we remember the days of Karzai and Musharraf when they didn't get along. And of course, Amrullah Saleh was seen as pro-India and or certainly at loggerheads with Pakistan. But how do you expect this new sort of coalition government? I mean, Shehbaz Sharif has sort of been emperor uncrowned for a long time in Pakistan, now taken up. But of course, once former foes in the Sharifs and Bhuttos are now coalesced, Bilawal Bhutto, Shehbaz Sharif, to oust Imran Khan. And it's very Game of Thrones political maneuvering. And now with Shehbaz Sharif and Bilawal Bhutto, is that an Afghan strategy, or is it just, where do they pick up the pieces in Afghanistan?
Well, several things to keep in mind here. It's the military in Pakistan that calls the shots and makes all the final decisions on foreign policy issues, particularly when it comes to foreign policies toward key countries, including Afghanistan, which of course is Pakistan's western neighbor. So in that sense, the change in civilian leadership is not going to make a difference, and that the military will continue to call the shots. General Bajwa continues to be the army chief, at least until his term is scheduled to end in November. Secondly, I would anticipate that, despite that, if you want to look at how Shehbaz Sharif may look at Afghanistan, I would see continuity with Imran Khan, in the sense that I think any Pakistani prime minister would recognize that Pakistan does not have an interest in a collapsed state, in a failed state in Afghanistan. So in that sense, I think that you'll see Shehbaz Sharif pick up where Imran Khan left off in trying to, prop up the Taliban regime and trying to, get the world to deliver more financial assistance directly to the Taliban, which the world has not been willing to do. Shehbaz Sharif will also be very concerned about the issue of the Pakistan Taliban that I mentioned before. I would argue, if you want to look at a difference between Khan and Sharif in Pakistan, I think Sharif would be more supportive of military activities in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Imran Khan, as you had noted earlier, has always had a soft spot for the Taliban. He's made that very clear. And also, Khan, like the Taliban, has always virulently opposed any type of military activities in Afghanistan. Now, of course, it may not be Khan's or Sharif's decision to make about whether you use military counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, but I think that Sharif would be much more in line with the Pakistani military on that policy. The Pakistani military, of course, has been receiving the brunt, has been hit the most by these Pakistan Taliban attacks in Pakistan. So I think it's very much behind the idea of using military operations against the Pakistan Taliban in Afghanistan. But Shehbaz Sharif, I think, would be more supportive of that idea than Imran Khan. Final point on this, I think that on the whole, this new government in Pakistan is going to have a short shelf life. Elections will be happening in the summer of 2023, but they could happen a lot sooner. This government has a lot on its plate. It's got a major economic crisis. It's facing increasing pressure from Imran Khan, now in the opposition, who's mobilizing large crowds to try to push this government to step down. So I think that Shehbaz Sharif may be happy to just defer completely to the army and the intelligence service, the ISI, on the Afghanistan front. And I think it's notable that just in recent days, news has emerged that the last ISI director has been involved in working with the Taliban on new talks with the Pakistani Taliban. So I think Shehbaz Sharif and other civilian leaders are going to be focusing on other things, including their political survival and the economic crisis and this very disruptive opposition.
Yeah, Michael, just a couple of ironies to point out, the Taliban, which of course got back into power through being insurgents, now faces insurgent threats from the Islamic State or ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan. And ever since the Taliban came to power, the disruption, the bomb blasts that targeting Hazaras and Shia community has largely been taken over by ISIS-K, or they've claimed responsibility for it. Explain right now the power dynamics or the struggle right now that the Taliban faces, from the Islamic State. And even though both in some ways were seen as Sunni Islamic hardline, but of course Islamic State wants a caliphate, and the Taliban, of course, is trying a structured government approach which eschews a form of caliphate, or it's publicly speaking about inclusivity, which of course ISIS-K abjures. So is this now a new turf war that is going to play out in Afghanistan, the way we saw in Iraq after the government had fallen?
Yeah, absolutely. No conversation on Afghanistan can't happen without discussing Islamic State. And I think, just to emphasize that Islamic State Khorasan is the branch of Islamic State in Afghanistan. It is a formal affiliate of ISIS Central, so to speak. It was formally announced and established by the parent organization back in 2015. And I think many casual observers of Afghanistan may think that it's a recent phenomenon in Afghanistan. It's not. We know about that horrible attack outside the Kabul airport during the last few days of the withdrawal last year. But this group has been there for nearly a decade. It's been doing horrible things for a very long time. And it does not pose a threat to the Taliban's hold on power. It doesn't pose a threat to its political survival. But I think it does pose a major threat to the Taliban's legitimacy. And I say that because when the Taliban took over its main message, which has continued to propagate even up to now, is that it has restored peace and stability to Afghanistan. Now, it's true that if you want to look for silver linings in Afghanistan these days, there aren't many, but one of them is that indeed the war has ended, right? I mean, this 40 years of war for the Afghan people, which, they were, of course, you had war ever since the Soviets arrived in 1979, insurgency, civil war, and then the U.S.-led war, and all of that. All of that has ended, which is great news. But Islamic State, by carrying out these attacks frequently at a very intense rate, that undermines this notion that the Taliban has restored peace and stability. Because if the mosques are getting blown up and you got these car bombs and all of this, that really undermines that Taliban narrative. And the Taliban, it is a rival of Islamic State, and it has fought against Islamic State on the battlefield for a number of years with some success. But it's a lot easier to do that when you're an insurgent group and you don't have the responsibilities of the government. But now the Taliban is dealing with so many things: the humanitarian crisis, the economic crisis, so many other things. It's not as easy to do that. And also, Islamic State has gotten stronger since the Taliban takeover. With the departure of NATO forces and the collapse of the former Afghan military, you no longer have airstrikes being used against Islamic State, which had been really the main tactic used to manage the Islamic State threat by NATO forces and the Afghan military. The Taliban don't know how to operate air power. Also, the Taliban back in August of last year, they staged these prison breaks that, not intentionally on the Taliban's part, but it freed a lot of Islamic State fighters. So they got more manpower. They've likely been able to pick up a lot of weapons abandoned by the collapsed Afghan military. And the current environment in Afghanistan, where you have these horrible economic conditions, that's provided a ripe environment for radicalizations, where you could have new recruits of folks to join Islamic State to fight the Taliban. So this all makes things very difficult for the Taliban. And what the Taliban have done to this point, they have launched, ironically, counterterrorism operations against Islamic State, but they've been very crude and indiscriminate, very scorched earth in terms of tactics. They've killed a lot of civilians. They've alienated local communities, and that only works to the advantage of Islamic State. So ironically, you talked about irony here. The Islamic State has been able to benefit in ways that the Taliban used to benefit when it was an insurgency, when you have the governing regime using these types of activities that alienate local communities. And it's hard to imagine Islamic State benefiting from anything in terms of winning over public support. But when local communities see the Taliban doing these horrible things to go after terrorists, that is only going to redound to the benefit of Islamic State, unfortunately. So yeah, it's a big concern, a big threat for the Taliban for sure.
Michael, as we get to the business end of this recording, one of the things I see that a lot of the analysis that perhaps some people in the West may have missed is when we look at Afghanistan, there's a sense of talking about, yes, provinces like Helmand and places like Kabul and Kandahar and Mazar-e-Sharif and Herat, but Afghanistan is not just cities and provinces. It's largely based on tribal demarcation. Of course, you have the ethnic Pashtun, which are largely Taliban, where Taliban derives its stronghold from. You've got the Hazaras, who are the minority group that were targeted. You have Tajiks, you have Shias, you have Uzbeks, you have Balochis. And is there an understanding now that even given the fact that past administrations may not have focused on this aspect of Afghanistan as much, whereas even when governments were formed, some minority groups were left out, which is why some of the disenfranchisement happened. And even now with the Taliban in power, Hazaras are continued to be, marginalized. They're the targets of, the ISIS-K with Shias and Sufis are still targeted. I mean, break this down, that the whole the tribal aspect of Afghanistan, which is very sacrosanct to Afghanistan's ethnic fabric.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that it's obviously a very complex social, political, cultural environment in Afghanistan. And going back to the issue of what went wrong, I think that you simply had so many governments, so many U.S. governments and governments of other NATO countries that simply did not properly understand. I mean, there are many very smart, well-informed folks running U.S. policy in Afghanistan, but I think that even for experts, outside experts of the country, those that have studied the country for many years, longer than I have, so to speak, even they would admit that it's really difficult to understand these very complex dynamics, especially on very micro levels, so to speak. I think that the U.S. military tried, so to speak, to navigate these tribal dynamics, but clearly they failed. I think that it all comes down to the military efforts, the civilian casualties, as well as empowering and embracing some really nasty operatives on the Afghan government side, or those non-state actors like militias, whatever you want to call them, warlords who were aligned with the Afghan government of the day, but were very violent and were willing to do anything to achieve their goals. And U.S. intelligence operatives were perfectly happy to work with these folks. That, I think, really impacted perceptions of the U.S. and the U.S. war effort. And even for those many Afghans that hated the Taliban and wanted it to go away, didn't want it to return to power, I think that how the U.S. managed its military efforts and the players and the individuals that they worked with, even if they were careful to try to navigate these tribal dynamics and work with tribal leaders and so on, those all squandered, so to speak. But indeed, I mean, the basic realities that you laid out before, haven't changed. That the Hazara community, which has been marginalized for so long and were massacred by the Taliban back in the 90s and more recently by Islamic State, they're still very marginalized, and we see that playing out now. The Pashtuns continue to be the most represented in governing structures, including most recently by the Taliban. Though I should say that the Taliban have been able to co-opt a number of members of other ethnicities, including Tajiks and Uzbeks, and even they have been able to bring in a few Hazaras to serve within their regime, but they're small numbers, and these are token gestures for sure. But they're trying to do that. But indeed, it's always been very difficult for outside powers, not just the U.S., but going back in the long history here, looking at how the Soviets and the Brits and others have tried to navigate these tribal dynamics. It just simply has not worked. It hasn't been successful. And I think it sort of emphasizes a very simple truth that you can't expect outside players or outside powers to impose their will in ways that can be beneficial for Afghanistan, whether politically or developmentally, economically, whatever the case may be.
As just my penultimate question, you touched on Qatar and the Taliban having their foreign office in Qatar, and Qatar is obviously a very funny player in this. It's got Doha's Dubai competitor. It's a GCC country, but it's been in crosshairs with the Saudis as well as the Emiratis. When it was seen as close to Iran, we remember sanctions on it, and the Qatari government investing heavily with the PR stunts even in DC. And Qatar's role in this, given when Alice Wells was serving as Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, she had made trips to Doha. That's where sort of Qatar played front and center negotiation between the U.S. as well as Taliban-led and Afghan government at that time. What is Qatar's outlook beyond just being a host for the Taliban's external offices?
Well, I mean, certainly, Qatar is one of these capital-rich states that, for that reason, would have to be seen as a very strategic player by the Taliban, right? Because they're looking for capital-rich countries that will be willing to provide financial support, especially those beyond the Western countries, most of which would want to see, at a minimum, more respect for human rights and women's rights and inclusivity before being willing to provide assistance to the government, to the Taliban regime. But I think also Qatar has become increasingly important. Several months ago, I believe, the Biden administration designated Qatar as a mediator, sort of the country that would serve U.S. interests when engaging with the Taliban, sort of like how the Swiss sort of represent U.S. interests in Iran, that type of arrangement. Now, it's interesting because you see senior U.S. officials meeting with Taliban leaders, engaging with them. The U.S. is perfectly happy to engage engage with the Taliban, even if they haven't extended formal recognition. But clearly, they view Qatar as an important player, to the point that they're willing to view it as a mediator that could do more to help the U.S. pursue its interests with the Taliban. And I think that stems from a variety of factors. One being that indeed Qatar had been the host for the political office for so long. The Taliban values its relations with Qatar. And I think also there's an interesting Pakistan factor here, that I think the U.S. recognizes that Pakistan's utility in this story is decreasing, in the sense that, the U.S. had previously seen Pakistan as a key mediator vis-a-vis the Taliban, just because of the relations it had with the Taliban, because of the fact that it housed the Taliban and provided medical care and so on and so forth. But now that, on basic levels, the U.S. doesn't need Pakistan because it can engage with the Taliban itself. It's perfectly happy to do that. But it recognizes that Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban has suffered some bumps for the reasons that we mentioned before. So that makes Qatar all the more important. So yeah, I think that Qatar will continue to be a key player moving forward. That's not to mean that it's going to recognize the Taliban regime. I don't see that happening at all. But I do think, especially with the U.S. having designated it as an official mediator to the U.S. government vis-a-vis the Taliban regime, I think that means we're going to hear a lot more about Qatar and what it's going to try to do in Afghanistan.
Yeah, Michael. On a last note, it's hard to mix conflicts. Even harder to keep them out. And obviously, Russia, erstwhile Soviet Union, has been a key antagonistic key player in the region with the Soviet-led invasion in '79 until the '90s. Obviously, Russia has got a lot on its plate right now, given the conflict in Ukraine, where it's depleting in military resources and facing economic sanctions. But there was this talk right now, with an absence of a major power in the Mearsheimer, a great power competition, others will follow through. And there were talks about Russia getting a stronghold there, of course, with former USSR state being neighbors, all the stans. China, of course, with its BRI projects, and we touched a little bit about it, plus with Wang Yi meeting Mullah Baradar. And I think China still has its presence in Kabul, and along with Pakistan, didn't close it down. And we touched a little on Pakistan, but even Iran, which in the past has been on loggerheads of Taliban, given the Shia-Sunni imbroglio, given Taliban did target Shia groups in the past, and ISIS-K still continues to target Shia groups right now. And there's also the concern of what Iran wants to do in Afghanistan. So break down what China, Russia, if at all Russia is still active in Afghanistan, or Iran would like to look at this vacuum that's opened up in Afghanistan, because for China it's ripe for investments. Afghanistan still is mineral rich in some ways, and it follows through in China's BRI path.
Yeah, so I think that for many observers that oppose the U.S. withdrawal, there is this sense, this foreboding of a strategic nightmare impending, that once the U.S. left, some of the biggest rivals and competitors of the U.S. would be in position to step in and fill the vacuum left by the U.S. departure. And indeed, Iran, China, Russia, right? Those are the top U.S. rivals. And it's striking that most of America's top rivals are located in Afghanistan's neighborhood. But I would push back against that. I think that countries that you've mentioned, the ones that I mentioned too, Iran, China, Russia, they were always going to be very cautious about entering Afghanistan and trying to deepen their footprint after the U.S. withdrawal. And that is because of the unease about the security situation. I mean, yes, the war ended, and that has opened up opportunities, especially for China, to go in and provide assistance for development projects and all. They'd be a lot more comfortable working in an environment that's not at war. But the terrorism factor is really important here. And I don't think any of these countries are comfortable and have not received sufficient assurances from the Taliban that the terrorism threats that worry them are being addressed, right? So for Pakistan, we know it's the Pakistan Taliban. We've already talked about how they're not getting any assurances there. For China and for Russia, and especially for Iran, it certainly is ISIS. And we've discussed how that's been a problem, even though the Taliban is actually trying to go after ISIS, but it's not doing enough to appease the concerns of Beijing and Moscow, and especially Tehran. But then, of course, for China, the bigger concern is the Uyghur militant group, ETIM, TIP. I would argue that China has always exaggerated the threat posed by that group. These Uyghur militants have been much more involved in activities in Syria than they have been in Afghanistan. But it is a concern. And then you have Russia worries as well about some of these Central Asian jihadist groups that are holed up in Afghanistan, like the IMU, the Islamic Movement in Uzbekistan. And the Taliban has links and friendships with all of these groups other than Islamic State. And of course, the Taliban still has its relationship with al-Qaeda. So none of these countries are going to be willing to do much of anything at all until they get more assurances from the Taliban on counterterrorism. I do think that these countries are willing to live with the Taliban in power. I mean, we know Pakistan, as I said before, the Taliban is its preferred government. Iran certainly has concerns about the Taliban because it's, of course, a Sunni group, Iran being a Shia state. In the past, Iran has been attacked by Taliban operatives, and you had several Iranian diplomats that were killed in an Iranian consulate in Afghanistan some years ago. They want to see more Shias in the Taliban regime, but they're willing to live with it because they don't see an alternative. And I think China and Russia are comfortable with it as well. So I think that's to suggest that if these countries see the improvements that they want to see on the counterterrorism front, then they'd be willing to engage more. But until that happens, you're not going to see much forward movement, I think, particularly in terms of a physical presence of these groups, of these countries in a Taliban-led Afghanistan.
Michael, on that note, I think we've covered a good landscape. Really, thank you for being generous with your time and unpacking the imbroglio in Afghanistan and what's to come. So this is like a precarious house of cards. And thank you so much for your time, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having me.
And with that, we bring this episode of The Global Detail to a close. Join us next time for more conversations across an eclectic mix of subjects that reverberate around the world. This podcast has been a production of Karkata Media in association with Perspicacity Media LLC. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, email us at globaldetailpodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Global Detail Pod. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2022 by Karkata Media LLC. All rights reserved.